Welcome to People Helping People, the podcast to help social entrepreneurs build a stronger business and have a greater impact. I'm your host, Adam Morris, and today I'm very excited to dive into a topic near and dear to my heart, which is applied design thinking for social entrepreneurs. So if you're not sure about what social entrepreneurship is, basically it's businesses that have a revenue model that exist in order to solve a social issue. Maybe that social issue is homelessness or barriers to employment or some sort of equality or other kind of thing that separates us from living our best fulfilled life. And I love this place of social entrepreneurship. I've seen nonprofit models, for-profit models, all kind of existing in order to really change ways that we can deliver social impact. And it seems to attract a certain kind of person who shows up and says, yeah, I want to be a social entrepreneur. It's not the typical person who's like, oh, I want to maximize my revenue and, get into a nice venture capital track and build a multi-billion-dollar company. Usually the focus is much more on, hey, how can I serve the needs in my immediate community? I want to connect people and resources and build a sustainable model for that that's not relying entirely on grants or not on grants at all. And I've noticed there's like two types of founders, right? There's the entrepreneur who shows up and, they're like, okay, I have an idea in my head. I know what I want to build, and I'm going to go sit in my basement and build this until I'm ready to show it to the world. Then there's the ones that are out there in the community, always just coming up with ideas, having conversations, talking to people, and learning, developing their solution in their business with the people that they're serving at the same time. So if you're a social entrepreneur or any entrepreneur and you're like, hey, how do I actually get out of my basement and into the real world having conversations where I'm learning? This episode is for you. First came in contact with social entrepreneurship when I learned about Give Back Hack many years ago. Give Back Hack is an organization that brings people together to basically develop very new social impact ideas. So it gets people together, they pitch ideas, they spend time validating, hey, what about this idea is working and what do I need to refine and change? And a lot of the methodology behind Give Back Hack is design thinking applied in real time without like it being shoved down your throat of like, here's what the terminology is. And a lot of it is just this idea of like, hey, how do I evaluate my idea, figure out what assumptions I'm making, and then go out and validate, have conversations or run tests where I'm learning something to understand, is my assumption true or do I need to change it? So back when I was at college, we entered in this underwater vehicle design competition. Basically, we were designing a submarine to go through this course. And we went to a professor who had years of experience in this. And I remember him telling us a story. The story was that there were two companies that started out about the same time in figuring out how to lay the cables underneath the ocean. So these kind of underwater vehicles that would lay the cables from one end to the other in order to have like data exchange and things like that. They both started about the same time. And the first company said, hey, we're going to get something together. We're going to build a submarine. We're going to put it in the water and see what happens. Rushed through their design. They got it in the water and it was an utter disaster. The thing crashed and burned and basically was a complete waste of money. The second company decided, hey, no, we're going to engineer the right thing. And they went to the drawing boards. They designed the right underwater vehicle to do this. And they spent 10 years making sure that they were building the right thing. When they got ready for a test, they put it in the water and it performed flawlessly. It did its job correctly on the first try. Unfortunately, the company went out of business about 3 months later because the company that had put something in the water first had been learning and adapting and had gotten so far ahead of them that there was no way that they could compete. It took them so long to get to the starting point that the company that had just jumped in and made a failure in their first attempt had learned so much and it was so far ahead that they could not compete. And for me, this really encapsulates this idea that you learn by testing and having conversations and getting in front of people and getting that feedback. If you don't get that feedback, then you're trapped in your own head and your view of the world is very small. So how do we make that view bigger? Just one more story to illustrate this, because I think this happens a lot, especially with technology solutions. I've met a lot of really smart and talented technology developers who would rather program in front of the computer than get out and have conversations. And there was this one founder who spent a lot of time developing this really nice impact dashboard for nonprofits. And classic example of building in his basement, came up with something really unique in terms of the widgets and designs and things like that, built this entire system out and got all the pieces in place before approaching any nonprofits. when it came time to demo his software, he realized that nobody was really responding to his software. Nobody was saying, yeah, sign me up. It wasn't a big need that they had. And I think it was really hard for people to understand, hey, here's how your solution fits into what we need to do. It's really tough to push that forward because he had spent his time building what he imagined was the right solution, as opposed to building something with somebody that really solved the immediate need and problem that they were having. On the flip side, my friend Jerry started Rent or Mentor through Get Back Hack as this idea of like, hey, I want to build a better technology platform for matching people who have low income housing vouchers, these Section 8 housing vouchers, with the landlords that accept them. Now, he worked in the Columbus Housing Division, and he was really familiar with the existing solutions, understood very well, here's what the, what's needed in the marketplace, what the gap is, and why the existing solution is out of date, not functional, and just not a viable solution for connecting people with housing opportunities. And what I loved about Jerry is he was not a technology guy, right? He did not start by saying, all right, I am going to go and build a prototype technology platform in my basement. And when it's ready, I'm going to show it to the world and see if I can get a bunch of users on there to join it. No. He started with running a focus group. And I remember early on, he got a bunch of landlords in a room and basically did a focus group understanding like what their constraints were around accepting Section 8 housing vouchers. And his theory in his head was like people did not want to accept tenants that had Section 8 housing vouchers because they were afraid of what kind of tenants they might be. He learned from this focus group early on that that was not the case. The reason landlords weren't signing up to accept these vouchers was they thought the process was really complicated. And in their eyes, they thought, hey, these are great tenants. If they have a way to supplement their income, they're more likely to stay. They're more likely to take care of our places. So he very early on realized, hey, I have to build a different solution in order to make this process easy for my landlords. And he didn't stop there. So he went on from these kind of focus groups. Early on, he did a speed dating session where he got a bunch of people who had Section 8 housing vouchers and landlords who would accept them in the same room. And it was just kind of speed dating matchmaking. He observed the behaviors of what were going on and what the needs were on both sides of the story. And so he was learning like what this problem actually looked like and what people's actual needs were. Now, building a technology, especially one where you need kind of that threshold of people to be successful, takes a long time. And while he was building that, he got involved in different consulting projects and housing projects around the city that were dealing with low-income housing. And all the time, it's like here he is building up his audience, understanding what their needs were, understanding the intricacies of what's going on with low-income housing here in Columbus, Ohio. I just want to illustrate that, it was such a mind-blowing example to me of like, hey, this is design thinking in process, where the activities you do are designed to learn about your target audience and what problem they're having. And then adapting your solution as you go in order to make sure that you're giving the right balance. So today is about really diving in and looking at like, what does this mean for you? And what are some strategies that you can actually employ in your own social enterprise in order to adopt this methodology and learn quicker so that you're developing the right thing. So when I say design thinking, for me, that's a common term in entrepreneurship. I think a lot of people have different opinions about what that means. I'll tell you what it's not. It's not a bunch of sticky notes up on the wall where you make a nice little pattern with them. But it's a disciplined way of thinking in order to reduce uncertainty. And typically, you think of it as a design loop, right? So you start with some empathy, kind of understanding a problem and coming up and defining, hey, here is something that I need to test or learn more about. And then you go and ideate and brainstorm up ideas of like, here's the best approach that I can do. And then you go and you do a prototype or some kind of test to learn something. After you've done the test, then you take that back and use that to extend your empathy and understanding. And then from there, you kind of define, here's what the next point is. And you go around in this loop from building empathy and understanding to, defining what you're working on, what your assumptions are, coming up with ideas and brainstorms of like how you're going to approach it, then creating a prototype, and then going to create a test. From that test, feeding back to your empathy. As we think about design thinking, one core part of this is being able to design tests to validate an idea. Quite often we use the term MVP, your minimally viable product. And there's a famous example here. If you Google MVP, you'll likely see this image of a car being built. And what an MVP is saying, hey, you're not starting with the wheels and then building the chassis and then putting on the roof and then learning how to put the doors on the car and finally having a finished car. That's not the MVP process of building one thing at a time. So instead, the MVP approach is starting by understanding what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So what's the function of a car? It's to transport you from one location to another. And what's the quickest and easiest way that you can do that? Instead of designing a car, maybe you create a skateboard. You give that to a person and try it out and understand, hey, how does this solve your problem of transportation? They get on the skateboard and they're like, okay, I can move, but it's really slow and I can't steer this thing. And so it doesn't really solve my problem. And so you go on to the next step. And maybe the next step is, all right, let's try a bicycle, right? All of a sudden they're like, hey, yeah, actually I can steer this thing. I can get to where I want to go a lot quicker. And they come back to you and they say, hey, this is actually perfect. This is all I need. I needed a way to get from home to work, and this has an added benefit of exercise. Great, this solves my problem. Well, you're on this journey to build a car, and you just realize that the solution that somebody needs is a bicycle. Great, you've just saved a lot of money, resources, time, and effort, and you created a better end product and experience. So that's what we're looking for in this design thinking MVP process. All right, so how does this work in practice, right? You're a social entrepreneur and you're saying, okay, this is great. I'm not building cars. So what do I actually start with? What does it mean to think about how do I approach building an MVP and put this to practice? So the first thing that you want to start with is understanding what assumptions that you're making about your business and which ones are the most risky ones, such that if the assumption that you're making is like totally false and not true, it's going to have the biggest impact on what you're doing and you need to totally shift directions. So in general, what I found is that there's 6 categories of assumptions that you typically make about your business. The first one is about your customer. Who exactly is your customer, right? And where do you find them? That's a big assumption, that you know who they are and how to reach them. The second one is, do I understand the problem? And I think this is where people get off really quickly, because you think you have a view of like, here's the problem that I'm trying to solve, and you know it very well. Sometimes, yes, you do have personal experience, and that personal experience is so important. But sometimes you have a theory in your head of like, yeah, this was my experience. This is how everyone else experiences this problem, or this is how important this problem is to everyone else. But a big question in entrepreneurship is, hey, is the problem I'm solving actually important enough that somebody's going to act and pay or do something about it? Or is it just a minor inconvenience? Or is there like an easy way that they can solve this problem, which does not involve the investment in whatever I'm providing? The third category is your solution. Yeah, you've identified a problem and you've come up with this great idea in your head for a solution, but is it the right solution? Does it actually inspire somebody so much that hearing about your solution, they're like, yeah, I'm going to pay money to dive in and do this? Talking about payment, the next type is payment and revenue, right? Does this actually work as a sustainable model? Will people pay you the right amount in order to make this business model work? And you can be like, yeah, I have this great idea for sanitizing dinner plates at a restaurant, and it only costs $500 to sanitize that plate perfectly using my system, and you're like, well, no restaurant's going to pay $500 per plate in order to clean it. Probably not a good solution. So figuring out, hey, do you have that right price and revenue for solving the problem? The next category is distribution. And this one is challenging because I think quite often you start with focus groups and surveys and talking to people, and you can kind of find a few people in your network who you can really talk to and get feedback, but it doesn't really tell you much about your distribution model of like how you're actually going to reach this audience on scale in order to sell your product. And then finally, if you're a social enterprise, there are these assumptions that you make about the impact that you're going to have. And quite often people, you have this great idea and it's like you say, hey, yeah, here's the impact that I think I'm going to make. But being able to measure if that claim actually holds up and understanding how you're going to measure that to say, yes, I'm really having the impact that I'm going on. It's a hard thing to do. So most founders have dozens and dozens of assumptions. The point is you have to start with the one that is the most risky assumption, the one that matters most to you right now. The one that, yeah, I think this is true, but if it was wrong, I've got to scrap what I'm doing or change my direction completely. So how do you approach this? How do you figure out what your riskiest assumption is? Well, to be honest, you start with scoring it in a very simple way, right? You write it down on a piece of paper and you're like, all right, how uncertain am I about this assumption that I'm making? And rank it. How critical is this assumption to my business idea? And then the other dimension to look at is like, what's an easy way that I could test this and verify that it's right? And it's important here not to get stuck on like assumptions that are just intellectually interesting. You want to touch on the assumptions that are going to impede your progress in the biggest way. This is where I found like ChatGPT and AI tools are really helpful. because you can basically do a brain dump of all your assumptions. You can talk about what you're currently experiencing and what you know about your customers and get some feedback from another resource. It's also a great place to bounce these ideas off of somebody else and say, hey, here's how I'm thinking about my business. Just get feedback from somebody that says, yeah, if you're looking at these, which one do you think is the riskiest assumption that I have that I need to validate? Now, once you've decided what your riskiest assumption is, the next stage is to go on and actually build a test, some way to validate that assumption, that it's either incorrect or correct, so that you can learn from it. And I think this is where some of the magic of design thinking comes in, because it's very easy as a founder to say, yeah, I'm going to go run a survey, I'm going to run a focus group, I'm going to learn something, or I'm going to build a prototype and get it in front of people. But this is where customer learning really comes into focus. And when you know what that riskiest assumption is, then before you go and talk to anybody, you can start to design tests that will answer the question around your assumption. Basically say to yourself, hey, what do I need to learn from this test? What is the signal that will tell me that I'm on the right track or I'm on the wrong track? Now, there's this fantastic book called The Mom Test by Robert Fitzpatrick. And Robert Fitzpatrick really has done this great job of approaching how you talk to customers. One of the core theses of his book is that, if you go and just show somebody, hey, here's my idea, what do you think of it? That they usually lie because they're trying to be nice. Or they're biased by your solution and they're like, yep, that's a great solution. Because when you're presented with an idea, all of a sudden you imagine like how it is to work with it. And he lays out this really nice approach for being able to have conversations where you talk about people's experience and you start to look for signals of if they mention the problem that you're solving as one of their top concerns. You can then explore like what they've done in order to solve that problem, to understand what their urgency is, what they've paid for other solutions, or how much they actually care. There's kind of an art form to that. But the best way to do that, I always recommend the Mom Test. It's just a great resource when you're in this early stage of customer learning and you want to have really good conversations. Now, as you look at these assumptions and you start to say, all right, I'm going to design a test, there's a whole lot of different ways that you can validate an idea. And different questions need different tests. So let's start with like 5 basic tests and like when you use them. For a new idea, one of the first things that you typically start with are customer interviews. And what you want to learn from customer interviews are really clarity around your problem and understanding the language that people who have the problem use and what triggers that they have around that problem, which would encourage them to go and look for a solution. Next up, alongside customer interviews, are surveys, right? And surveys are great for detecting patterns, being able to get something out to a large group and to seeing if there is a comparison between how people respond. It's a lot harder to get people's experience in a survey, but it's a great way to reach a large number of people to get feedback. The third common test in this category is running focus groups. And focus groups are great for being able to present people with a workflow and understand how they interact with a solution that you're proposing, or have a group discussion around how they're experiencing a problem. The same people in a room and really understanding, doing a deep dive around that experience. Then you start to move more into the actual prototyping phase. And I think there's 2 great approaches for prototyping that are easy, especially at the beginning. And one of that is putting together a pilot program that's kind of a concierge model, right? Where you're manually solving a problem for somebody else. And so you are providing a solution without having to build a product or service out. And that might look like I am coaching somebody through a problem that they have, or I'm going to go and do one-on-one guidance with somebody. It could be like, hey, we're going to do a workshop around this topic and provide some information, but also get people's experience about what they're doing. The other fantastic way to prototype an idea is to take a look at your target audience, the problem that they're having that they want to solve, and see if you can come up with a pre-order that solves part of the problem, and see if you can get people to put money down, buy something on a pre-order that will solve their problem. I think there's something about running revenue tests, which is really exciting, where it really teaches you, are people willing to pay me money about my idea? It gets you out of this realm of understanding, is this a problem, to like, will people actually put the dollars down? And there's something cool about being able to put a pre-order together. And sometimes it can be something small, like it can be a pre-order for an event or for a workshop or for a digital product. And if people are willing to put that money down, then 1, it signals the willingness to pay. And it also signals if the messages that you're putting out there resonate with people. And those are really good ways to start testing your idea and understanding if you're on the right track. Now, I think the tendency with idea validation is to turn it into something much bigger than it really is. The temptation is to go out and be like, all right, this is going to take me 6 months. I'm going to build up this complex prototype or this big event. I'm going to get the right people in the room. It's going to take me all this time and effort. After 6 months, then I'll learn something. That's the wrong approach. When you think about these quick validation tests, they should be something that you can do in 1 to 4 weeks. Think in terms of a very short time frame and something that's a small effort that's going to get that learning to you quickly. It's about the learning. It's not about designing the perfect experience. So for example, if you want customer interviews, there's a site, I think it's userinterviews.com. You can go and pay like $1 a minute and get the right person to do an interview with. You can go on and do that really quickly without a lot of thinking or planning. There are people that are like, yes, I'll do interviews all day with somebody. You pay me $20 for a 20-minute interview. Perfect. You can go on and do that in a matter of, a few hours. So one other concept that I brought up here was doing revenue tests. And this for me has always been a big struggle because I hate selling. It's uncomfortable for me. I'm not a born entrepreneur. I'm not a born salesman. And so I think I've always had a lot of hesitations around putting myself out there and putting a dollar amount on something and saying, yep, will you buy it? But what I'm finding is that when I put something out that's like a pre-order, get somebody to put money down on it, it teaches me so much more about my messaging and how I'm connecting with people. And I think there's a lot of things that you can actually develop which are paid at a low level, such as a workshop or a coaching session or a digital product. Like all these things that you can do for a low amount of money and learn something about your target audience and their willingness to pay. So when you're thinking about validating ideas, when you can start doing those small revenue tests, I think that is one of the greatest things to push forward your idea. If you can get early on paying customers as you're developing out your big thing, then one, they're going to be even more excited about being able to solve the problem in a much bigger way. And you'll have that audience and that experience built up of selling. All right. So we just did this deep dive in design thinking of understanding what our riskiest assumption is, coming up with validation ideas of like, here's how you actually go and validate and test and build a prototype to get some feedback. Now, once you've carried that out, the next important step is to incorporate the learning, to actually be like, what did I actually learn from this? And then say, hey, how does this influence the direction that I'm taking? I think a lot of that is much easier once you have that information to go in and actually do the reflection, but it's an important part that you shouldn't miss. And then update of like, all right, now what's your next riskiest assumption? You've learned a little bit about this piece of the pie. What's the next piece of the pie that you need to figure out about? And if you follow this methodology, what you notice as you progress is that your decisions are much clearer and they're much more informed, and you're much more connected with your target audience as you're building the solution. So thank you for listening today. I really wanted to share this model because it's something that I use with a lot of the social entrepreneurs that I work with. And it's very powerful in terms of course correcting early on, especially when you're early stages of building a business and you're looking for that guidance of like, how can I most effectively use my time? So if you are a social entrepreneur or an entrepreneur of any sort, I would challenge you to step away and just write down, hey, what are 10 assumptions I'm making about my business? Circle the one that you're like, hey, this one would have the biggest impact on my idea. And then come up with a few ideas of like how you might test this and see if you can run a test in 1 week to 4 weeks to answer that question and move forward. Now, if you're doing this and you get stuck, reach out to me. I love speaking with social entrepreneurs. I'm very accessible, and this is one of the things that brings me the most joy. So I hope you've listened to this, and thanks for being here for this episode of People Helping People. In our next episode, we'll be back to a guest, bringing you some more valuable insight. But till then, take care. Cheers. Thanks for listening.